Hello everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Razvan Venter, and over the next 20 minutes, I will talk to you about the new standard from ETSI EN 303645, the contents and general idea of the standard, but also its practical applicability and adoption. Of course, this is a virtual conference, so unfortunately we cannot see each other face to face, but this is how I look like. I'm working for a company called Secura, based in the Netherlands, and focused on security testing, compliance, and certification of various products such as consumer devices, medical devices, industrial, automotive, and so on. Within Secura, I'm currently leading the group focused on security certification, so working with multiple standards and certification schemes. And I'm also involved in quite a few international standards organizations, among which also, of course, the IoT Security Foundation. This is the outline of the talk that I would like to discuss with you about. So we have a couple of topics. We will first start with a bit of background behind ETSI and behind the need to introduce yet another standard focused on consumer IoT security. But then we'll zoom in more about the practical approach and practical applicability of the standard. We'll talk about how can it be approached from a manufacturing point of view, but also from a testing and certification lab point of view. We'll talk about international context, about the countries that have already adopted and started to use the standard in practice, but also the regions or countries who are currently thinking about this approach. And finally, of course, we'll summarize the next steps, which should be used in order to increase the adoption of this very useful baseline. So to get started, a bit of a background behind the standard itself, but also a very quick summary of the topics within it. On this slide, the picture on the right-hand side is actually a picture that I used in one of my IoT security talks from this conference 2 years ago. And that talk was aimed to increase awareness about the fact that we have increasing number of risks and threats in IoT component in our IoT devices, and we simply have to address it by having relevant standards, frameworks, or certification schemes in place to define a baseline for secure development. And guess what? Well, 2 years later, we're still on the same track. We have an increasing amount of threats and risk associated with those devices. But not only that is increasing, but also the total number of IoT products which are deployed in the world, as we can see on the left-hand side of the slide. So what have we done in the meantime in terms of standards and frameworks? Well, quite a lot, and I'm happy to say that at this point we have quite a few international standards, frameworks, but also certification schemes in place. However, we also noticed that there are a couple of limitations with those existing sources, and those are mostly coming from the fact that they are a bit complex, so time-consuming and budget-consuming, which is making manufacturers be a bit cautious about implementing them, but also their international recognition aspect, because the existing standards are maybe too much locally focused, sometimes in UK, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in Asia, but not that much seen as an international baseline. And this is the part that those are the parts that we need to increase. So both the baseline aspect of security, but also the international recognition in order to be able to approach security efficiently in a development stage. Happily, we have the standard that we're talking about today, which is the ETSI 303645, which is a standard defined by ETSI, one of the main European standards bodies, together with CEN and CENELEC. And this standard has been already drafted for already quite a while. It has been started in 2018 within a special task force from ETSI, but then it continued later on in 2019 when we had the first draft, which was actually a technical specification, TS 103645. And happily, in the beginning of this year, we had the first version of the EN 303645 being released. What is the value of the standard? Is that it's an European norm or European standard. Therefore, it carries the obligation, actually taken from its definition, it carries the obligation to be implemented at the local level in all the countries members of ETSI, but also leads to the withdrawal of potentially overlapping standards. So therefore, we are at this point officially talking about something that needs to be internationally recognized. It's not local, it's not even for a particular group of countries, but it needs to be at least across the whole Europe. And that's definitely something important from a general adoption point of view. Now, we have multiple types of categories of requirements in a standard, and those could be grouped into technical, product capabilities, process-specific requirements, but also usability requirements for the products. So unfortunately, without having the chance to go through the requirements one by one because of the limited time slot, I will try to give you a bit of an overview of what you could expect within the standard. So to start with the product capabilities category, there are quite a few topics that a standard talks about. They're kind of the usual suspects in terms of IoT security, which are secure passwords, software updates, storage, but also communications of data, minimal configurations, and minimizing the attack surfaces, resilience to attacks, but also to outages, and of course also validating the input data, for example, through fuzzing. This is from a product capabilities, so product-specific point of view. Now, in terms of process and usability, also quite a few requirements grouped in this category. Process-specific are procedures which need to be adopted by the developer, such as efficient vulnerabilities disclosure. So whenever a new threat and potential vulnerability is being detected in the product, how do they react to this? What is the process? And very likely this will lead to the need for prompt software updates for patching. Also, analysis of telemetry data, which is being sent by those devices, but also existence of sufficient and clear documentation and user guidance towards the users. From point of view of usability, we are mostly interested in the way in which those standards could be efficiently followed by the users, but also from a point of view of how easily, how secure they can be installed and maintained. So once again, user guidance is quite critical to satisfy those kinds of requirements. All right, now let's dive a bit deeper into how the standard should be approached. And we will take a look first at the point of view of the manufacturers and then switch towards the point of view of the security labs or certification schemes. So to start with the manufacturers, well, I will start with a bit of a bold remark that in our current view, based on the experience of testing the standard in a couple of pilot projects, we believe that it's fair to assume that current products don't and will not meet the standard 100%. And the reason why we're saying that is because existing products, the ones that are on the market or already in our homes, are either in the production or their post-production lifecycle phase. So they're either being produced and released at this point, or even worse, production has already stopped and they're simply existing on the market or in our homes. So given the fact that the ETSI standard has been released relatively recently, it's pretty much impossible for the products who are being already in the production phase to have incorporated the requirements of that standard because it didn't exist at the moment when they were developed. That's why it's very critical for product manufacturers to embrace the requirements of this standard during development, because that's the moment when they are fully in control of what kind of security they implement into their product. So talking about security by design, not reactive, but a proactive approach. Finally, the conclusion, the standard is intended to be a baseline, so it doesn't come with the idea of having an extremely complicated set of requirements. Therefore, it's not intended to be a burden for manufacturers to implement it. If it is, then it means the standard should be revised. But from the beginning, it is meant to be a baseline to be used in the development of the products which are being manufactured. Now, switching sides and taking a look at the approach that could be taken from a lab point of view, of course, manufacturers are implementing the standard into their products, but ideally we need a third party to actually test the existence and sufficiency of those security controls which are embedded into their products. And those are the labs. And once again, talking about the fact that the standard is a baseline, well, as we said, implementation of those requirements into the product should be smooth, but also testing, validation, and potentially certification should be a smooth process as well. So right now we're talking about the need to have a clear test methodology in order to approach those requirements, but also as smooth as possible for communicating between the test laboratory and the manufacturer, especially from the point of view of asking for evidence. If possible, in order to make things smooth and quick, it should be that most of the testing can be performed from a black box or gray box approach without the need to ask for extensive sets of documentation to the customer. That would only make things more difficult and more time consuming. We're also talking about an ideally minimized testing time frame. Once again, we're talking about a baseline, so we don't want testing and certification to take weeks or months, but be as smooth and as short as possible, because that will motivate manufacturers to go towards those test labs and to ask for independent third-party testing and certification. Talking about demonstration of compliance, of course, that's kind of a classic approach. It could be achieved through a combination of activities, which include documentation review, but also various types of testing, such as validation or pen testing. Talking about documentation review, well, those are mostly the requirements that could be easier and in a more smooth manner demonstrated through reviewing either the processes or various design documents of the product. Now, talking about process review, of course, there's not that much to test over there, but it's mostly a review of the process, procedures, and potentially interviews with developers. But then from a design review situation, it's preferable to be able to address some requirements in a smooth manner, while on the other hand, testing would be quite challenging. For example, instead of performing extensive side channel analysis to confirm the security of keys, for example, it is much more effective to simply ask for a key table or potentially sensitive data sheets of secure controllers in order to demonstrate compliance. That leads to a much more effective way of evaluating. So wherever possible, and wherever the lab feels like it's easier to demonstrate something through document review and design review, that will lead to a much better way to adopt the standard, because it will simply lead to less testing and evaluation time. But of course, that being said, testing still remains a main aspect of the standard. So wherever possible, testing should be performed, both from a validation point of view, where we are interested on whether or not the security feature is existing into a design, but also from a pen testing point of view, in which we know that a feature is existing, but we're still trying to break it. And here, again, we talk about the usual types of pen testing, like password brute forcing, fuzzing, or DOS attacks, or also physical attacks. And what I was previously saying, that at this point we don't expect products to be fully compliant, is the fact that, as you can see here in the examples of some of our report findings, we still find issues, we still find risks into the products. So it happens. It's normal, because those risks were already existing there before the standard has been released. But still, it's very important to have a test lab independently test and determine those risks before simply claiming that the product is secure. Now, talking about interpretation, that's also an interesting topic. So let's take a look at what is it meant by requirements interpretation. Well, the standard is intended to be as flexible as possible. So that being said, there are some requirements which are drafted in, let's say, a flexible manner. And to take maybe one of them, the first one on the slide, 551, which says that consumer IoT shall use best practice cryptography. Well, it doesn't say what is best practice cryptography, so therefore it opens the door to the manufacturer to be kind of flexible in what kind of key algorithms, key sizes, and so on they choose. With that being said, of course, from a testing point of view, we don't want to see algorithms who are being already broken, very old, and very vulnerable. So it's still the need to rely on international publications that dictate some minimum requirements for cryptography, such as UL 2900 or FIPS 142, or maybe some other ISO or IEC standards that define crypto algorithms. But it's flexible in the sense that it doesn't tell you what exactly to put inside. And that's in fact the case with multiple requirements. And that's simply for the reason that the standard wants to promote adoption. The standard wants to be applicable, that it doesn't want to be strict. But now, talking about lessons learned, we have already performed a couple of pilots based on the standard, and the findings are kind of meeting our expectations. As I mentioned before, we haven't found so far one product that fully meets the standard. And the typical kind of security findings that we discovered during our testing are linked to insecure firmware updates, or the possibility to extract data or firmware from a device, sometimes denial of service, for example, by attacking the USB interface. We have performed that in practice a couple of times. But also more from a process point of view, the lack of clear user guidance or the clear vulnerability disclosure, contact information, All right, now for the last part of the presentation, let's switch towards the international relevance and how much the standard is already adopted across various countries. So we will have some examples, but first to start, well, the standard is issued by ETSI, and ETSI, even though it sounds European, it's actually quite an international organization. And as we can see in this slide, those are the countries, the ones which are highlighted in different shades of blue, the countries that are having members in ETSI. There are quite a lot. We see it's the whole Europe, but also Asia, but also North America and Australia. So that means that it is very much expected that most of those countries at some point will ask for compliance based on this standard, based on this baseline, which is of course something very nice. That being said, there are already some examples of countries that are implementing first versions of labeling or certification schemes. And I have a couple of them as examples. First of all, in Finland, there is a local initiative driven by the Traficom agency, the national security agency in Finland. Secura is already collaborating with the scheme, and how it works is that they have put in place a vendor questionnaire to ask the developers to explain what security they have in their product in line with the requirements of the standard, and then independent labs are simply validating the claims of the developer. It is aimed to be smooth, efficient, and relatively quick in time, and it ends with a label issued by the Finnish government that could be attached on the product. That's not the only scheme that is currently active. There's a second one, which I find very interesting because actually it's not from Europe, but it's from Asia in Singapore. It is called the Singapore CSA, Cybersecurity Agency scheme, and it's a labeling scheme that, as we can see on the slide, comes with 4 different levels. The last 2 of them involve third-party testing, and the first 2 of them involve self-evaluation, but it already could be used, and it's already being used to test, for example, routers or smart home devices, which are being considered to be high-risk targets. And it's a very interesting thing because it demonstrates that a standard is and will be even more adopted internationally and outside of Europe. Besides those schemes that are already active, there are some initiatives currently in development. The Netherlands is working on drafting the first labeling scheme focused on the requirements of the standard, and Secura, the company that I represent, is supporting in that aspect. In UK, we know that we have a new cybersecurity law which is being introduced right now, and which will focus on some of the standards from some of the requirements from the ETSI standard. But also there are quite a few private certification schemes which are being operated by big international certification bodies. And well, there's one issued by PV, which is already active and being able to issue certificates in line with the requirements of ETSI. Finally, we all have heard about the European Cybersecurity Act, and we know that the first schemes are already being drafted as part of the Cybersecurity Act, and they're focused on common criteria and cloud security certification. But at the same time, we know that there's a clear need to ensure that consumer products will also be, at some point, hopefully not too late, certifiable in line with the European Cybersecurity Act. And when that moment comes, we know that the ETSI standard, because it's an European baseline, will be the main candidate for becoming the source of requirements for that certification scheme. So something very much to be kept in mind by product manufacturers. Now, we're getting close to the end of the presentation, so let's summarize with some next steps towards European and international adoption and towards this harmonized baseline. We have seen quite a couple of topics in this presentation, but in the end, just to conclude, the standard aims to be a baseline, so it shouldn't be complex, it shouldn't be hard, it should be just right to demonstrate that the product is secure enough. It's an EN norm, so it will have priority against other similar initiatives, other similar standards in at least European countries. So that's what makes it very attractive to be taken into account by developers already from the development stage of their products. It's already being adopted in a couple of countries, and local mandate from the standard, from our point of view, from what we see, is really a matter of time because some other countries are already looking at it. Manufacturers are strongly encouraged to start aligning their products to the requirements already from an early stage, from development stage. But of course, they're not the only drivers. Labs should be able to facilitate smooth testing, which goes quick and preferably doesn't ask for an extensive set of documentation from the manufacturers. But of course, also national authorities should be able to quickly and smoothly develop certification schemes in line with the standard to facilitate efficient labeling, because that will definitely be seen as by the manufacturers as a nice and attractive way to go towards certification. Those are my thoughts. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for staying with me over the last 20 minutes. And at this point, I'm very happy to try to answer your questions. Thank you.